for proposal. I'll start again, sorry. So how does the timeline for the downtown parking plan work with the request for proposals for the downtown plaza lot for affordable housing? Because the request for proposals, they're saying, is going to be let by the end of 23. And the way it's set out right now, the parking plan won't be done by then. So, are they going to work together, or how is that going to happen? So from the league's perspective, we've always taken a strong position on wanting a downtown plaza to be used for affordable housing. So that's sort of a high priority from the league's perspective, is that gets, done in an orderly fashion. Can he explain more about the possible builder's remedy? That might be one that we want to leave till later. I don't know. But what specific height increase does he plan to recommend for the CN, the CT, and the mixed use? Because that was a question that HCD specifically asked, is how much higher are you going to go? And it's left open now, and they purposely left it open on the initial draft, but they're going to have to pin that down for the next draft.
Okay.
With the review of Village Corner zoning, what would he expect there? Now, he indicated to us, Freddie, in this other conversation, that no one has come forward with any proof of a planned community or PUD or anything else at Village Corners. It's like urban myth. I wondered about that. There's nothing recorded,
Do you hear somebody's voice?
I hear Susan talking, but Susan, are you not able?
She's on your phone.
Shall I hang up and she'll be on here?
Is she not able to?
You can't get into Zoom? Oh, but you can be on the Zoom with audio? Yeah, but you're not hearing the others.
I never saw her ask for being admitted into the meeting.
Did you hit the Zoom thing so that Freddie could? Yeah, but if you just ask to join, you can join without the video and just with the audio. If you ask to join, she can let you in and you can talk there instead of on my phone.
And then I'll go like you suggest. But I'm listening.
Okay, well, I just turned on the speaker, so maybe people can hear.
About the kind of a mystery village court too, because nothing much had come of that on any of the things that I had seen.
Right, and they asked people to, they asked people to produce the documentation, and I know Nisa told me that, and someone else told me that, and according to Nick, he has, we all knew there was nothing recorded, and when you look back in the council minutes, there's only a vague reference to something, and so whether promises were made, there's no proof of anything. And so I think basically that particular zoning goes away, but I wanted to ask him about that because that's obviously a prime location where you could have more units if there was not that impediment that we thought there was before. And when we talked to him before, Janine, he said he hadn't really explored it, right? He just knew that he hadn't found any proof of anything. And then I also wanted to know what he anticipates for the Rancho Shopping Center in terms of the site inventory, because when we talked to him, he said he hadn't had a chance to really study that. So, in general, what are the impacts of AB 2011 on San Antonio Road, Foothill, El Camino Real? And again, he told us he hadn't really sorted that out yet. But those are sort of important in terms of the heights and mainly the heights that you could have in those places. What does he propose for the appeal process? Because that was something that HCD found fault with, was the appeal process. They said if it goes to the council, if you remember, Freddie, that,
it will just no definition of what decisions would be appealed and on what basis the appeal could be taken. Yeah.
So what we were recommending to him is that and he seemed to be in agreement, but we should ask him again what he's going to be recommending exactly. That it would be a very tight appeal process. It would move very quickly, and that you could, the council could only review on the grounds that the appeal was made, sort of like a typical court thing.
I have a question about this. Yeah. Does the council have to agree to this? Oh, here's
Yes.
Susan trying to get.
Yes. Okay.
Here's Susan trying to get into the meeting. Well, that's what I was wondering, and I'm, so I guess we're assuming that they're on board with this. Do we have any
No.
feedback? Have we spoken to any of them to see what their thoughts are?
No, but the way it was laid out in the draft was really getting rid of a lot of council control over this sort of thing, and nobody on the council raised their hand. So
Yeah, I'm just hoping that they're okay with that, because, if they're not,
I have spoken with a couple of council members independently, obviously, for Brown Act reasons. And they don't have a problem with it. And now obviously we're not including Lynette. I did not talk with Lynette. But the other two felt that it was an important step. And let me be more candid. They're kind of like, wow, it's going to take some getting used to, but we understand that it's an important step to quickening the process. And we understand that many other agencies are doing this. And so we kind of have to get with it. So that's where they were. They weren't like, oh yes, we should absolutely do this. They were like, yeah, it's going to be hard for us, but we think it's an important step, and everybody is doing it in other agencies. So we've got to kind of jump in as well.
and it's, to me, one of the best ways to get rid of subjectivity. Because I don't know if you've sat through those, but my God, it's just outrageous,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
Right. No, I mean, I think as the downside in any of this is that you have to have competent staff. But, so, I mean, at some point they might decide they don't have competent enough. But at this point, I think everyone thinks that Nick is competent. And I think that Stephanie Williams, that he hired over from Mountain View, who's the zoning administrator there, is competent. And he claims he's fully staffed now, right, Janine?
But the planning commission also has to be knowledgeable.
Mhm.
I have questions about, I was pretty distressed to see that our ADU ordinance is not compliant with state law, because we have.
But here's the thing about that ADU ordinance. The prior staff and the prior city council has gotten much specific, like down to writing spec types of input saying, we are not in compliance. Here's a letter from HTC supporting us that we're not in compliance. Here's the text you have to add. And they did not add it. There it is in the housing element saying you need to add it.
So here's my question. Here's my point to Nick Zornes is, we need somebody on staff or our outside counsel, and our outside counsel, Eric, is the housing, the zoning law expert. I think we need somebody, and I understand he's hiring somebody for this position, but we need somebody who's going to keep up with all the state laws, who's going to review our ordinances to make sure they're compliant, and doing that on an ongoing basis, because just because it's compliant this year doesn't mean it's going to be compliant next year. And we have to have confidence that those people are going to kind of overrule the council, so to speak, because the council has no expertise legally on these issues. And they need to, in my opinion, they need to respect, our legal counsel's advice and do what we're told so that we are in compliance. And what are they doing about that? Yeah.
Comment on that, Freddie, about the compliance issue is that unless, depending on what kind of counsel you hire, you have to, let's take, for example, Jolie, okay, our city attorney. She's got one mandate, okay? And it's not necessarily to just interpret the law or be aware of the various legal statutes. She has a higher mandate, which is to protect the city from liability, okay?
Yes.
Protect the city from being sued.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times that will voice a hyper conservative, if you will. And I don't mean, conservative politically. I mean, with regard to the law, hyper conservative stance, because reduce that risk to zero, not 10%, not 5%, zero. And so the way the law works, as you probably well know, is that, there is a certain level of risk in terms of interpreting law, and it'll be up to various human beings to decide whether you are actually in conformance with the law or not. And so therefore, most agencies agree that taking 10 to 15% risk on your legal decisions is not going to get you into trouble. But taking 50 or 60% risk, that is probably going to get you into trouble. And if you defy the law, you're definitely going to get into trouble.
No, I understand.
The closing comment I would say is that as we hire.
No, I understand. And, most of these laws, you don't know what they mean until they're challenged. And you have case law that interprets the laws. I mean, that's the way that works. And I totally get that. My concern is I've always thought that we were a little sloppy, let me just put it that way, and not very, we're not good at looking at the details. And I'm just hoping that Nick is on board with some sort of review process that's a not just a one look and forget it, but an ongoing review process to make sure that we stay in compliance, because the laws keep changing. I mean, and all of these laws that get passed, many of them have an impact on what was passed prior. And so you just have to stay on board.
Right.
That's all. That's my only question. And I'm just kind of, I want to see
Yeah.
what the game plan is.
No, I agree with you. Janine, Freddie and I both used to be lawyers, so by the way, so, but anyway, I agree. And actually I have a lot of respect for Eric, but I think maybe that he's moved, I think, to Vermont. And oh yeah. So he's like on contract to Berlin and Cohen for certain things. So I'm a little concerned. I don't think that's anything that we want to raise with Nick, because I don't really know what the status is exactly and how it might change. I think he decided to go and be near elderly parents or something.
Oh, okay.
But I have a little bit of a concern just with what you're saying, Freddie, because frankly, I've heard Jolie make what I consider to be a number of mistakes in the last few years in terms of her interpretation of housing law. And so I know she does rely on him, and that's been important. And I thought Chris Diaz was terrible. So, I mean, I had arguments with Chris Diaz. So,
yeah. And so, you know what, Berlin or Cohen needs to find another California-based housing law expert that hopefully we could tap as the person who reviews our ordinances on a periodic basis. It's like, like an annual audit to make sure you're in compliance.
Comment on that, and that is that to the extent that we have staff that is competent, and therefore they present good cases, if you will, to the signatories, it also imposes on us to have good ordinances and have good code. So to the extent that cycle is closed, that where problems are found or loopholes are found or uncovered areas are found, that we actively advocate going back to correct our code.
Yes.
That really happened. And maybe not even correct, maybe create code that doesn't exist. Because unless an objective body like the Planning Commission, hopefully they are, at least they're analytical, that they're reviewing these documents, they have to be sure that they have that spec against which they're reviewing it. And then if an appeal happens, then it becomes more administrative to say, well, either you're in conformance with that document or you're not in conformance with that code. And therefore now we can decide whether or not to move the appeal forward.
Right.
So I hope that's the burden of having, objective standards, is that the standards have to be very robust, and that's why you end up with a 400-page type document. But it's required, otherwise it becomes.
Yeah.
Now, Sue, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me? Okay,
Yes.
My video didn't come through, but I have been listening to you guys, and the concern, I understand the concern about endless review and review before any action is taken, and these extensive reports get in the way of more city council and supporting staff understanding how to move forward. And it sounds to me as though the new staff is going to be better at communicating. Certainly the new city manager is better at communicating important points to the general public, and why the planning folk are either so slow or so tied up with these reports, I don't know. Our next door neighbors, well, across the street neighbors, have applied for a house complete redo, and they have gotten finally the demolition of the building, the house permit, but not the building permit. And, you know, it's been endless. And so this is, for me, a specific example of excessive, slow, cumbersome process in the city. Now, when you're talking about the housing element, well, that's just times 10 in terms of complexity and requirement that it be done more skillfully isn't the right word, but segment by segment shouldn't take this long or be this obtuse. So enough, hush.
Well, I think that's a good point, Susan. And, you know, if you could find out any more specifics from your neighbor in case there was time to ask him, you know, about a specific example, because I believe that when we spoke to him, and that's why my next question didn't really apply to what you're saying, was he going to recommend timelines for the entitlement process? Because Nick seemed to be saying that he thought that the actual building permit process was not really a problem, that had been expedited, and that their only problem was that a lot of people put in incomplete information. But he said that was a problem also with the entitlement process. But what, you know, HCD was concerned with how long our entitlement process takes. So one of our suggestions, I thought, would be, and we discussed this with him, and he seemed amenable, that he would recommend timelines for how long it would take to get something approved. And then those would be monitored on an annual basis. And then we actually suggested, and he seemed amenable to, on an annual basis, he would have like, you know, a review with the customers, the clients, you know, whether it's the builders, the developers, whatever, to see how that was working, to get feedback.
Well, that would be, well, as a newcomer to the city, that sounds like a good idea for streamlining and for what would you say, community satisfaction with city government. But I know that this focus is really on the housing element. That
it is.
The timeline is creeping up on us.
Programs for restraints, you know, restrictions, restraints on getting housing built. That falls in that category.
Right.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why the city themselves can't create metrics to measure their own performance. I mean, they have to know from the time of an application to the time the permit's issued, how long that took, how many go-arounds. They can, there's metrics that they can create and monitor themselves. I think going back to the developers, the builders, and saying, you know, maybe once a year, and saying, can you make suggestions to help us streamline this? What would you suggest to make this a better process or a faster process would be a good idea, but they should be able to, I wouldn't leave it up to they need to measure their own.
Absolutely, Freddie. That was just an additional suggestion, because Mountain View has done a little of that, of asking the developers to give feedback. And I think it's been somewhat helpful to get the feedback.
I think a lot of communities are doing that. So, I mean, I like that idea, but you know, accountability is how you make people perform usually. And so there's got to be a way of measuring their performance.
Right.
Question, Sue.
Yeah.
I hear you right? You said that Nick believes our permit process is fine. It's only the entitlement process that needs improvement.
That's what I understood him to say, was he didn't think that we had problems pulling the building permits. He thought it was, it was the entitlement process that was too slow.
Could it be possible, in light of what the other two is saying, that the focus has been on, large developments, and the permit process is, because it's such high priority and high priority, they're focusing on it, but on, single family new builds or remodels, they're not focusing on it, and therefore our performance is terrible?
I don't know. I mean, it's worth asking. That's why I'm saying, if Susan has that as an example, it would be worth asking the question the way you've just phrased it. I think, because I thought that's what he said, but we should ask about the building permit process as well, with that.
Right. To the extent that it applies to, I understand that an individual's, if I was trying to remodel my house, when I did remodel my house, the wait was extraordinary. It was ridiculous. But to the extent that we're also invested in ADUs, that could become a big deal too. So I think it's fair to add that to the list of questions.
Right. He seemed to think with the new ADU person, it was going better, but that's related. Yeah. Then I also, and this is related to what I just asked before about the appeal process. So it's maybe part of that question, because it's what you asked, I think, either Janine or Freddie, and that is, does he think the council understands what review authority they're giving up? I mean, because that's tied to the whole, process, but
there needs to be a conversation. There needs to be an agreement, I think. I mean, I get Brown Act, but there needs to be an understanding by at least a majority of the council members that they are going to sign off on this, because I think it's foolish to go forward
right
when it's going to blow up in your face 2 months later.
Well, they'll have to have that conversation in January, but I didn't think they had a good conversation about that for the initial draft. And in the initial draft, they were giving up a lot of authority, and it just seemed to roll by. They didn't ask that many questions. So I think they need to have that clear discussion, and the public needs to understand, because it's a real difference when you think that the council is going to be weighing in on how a building is going to look, or setback, or everything else, so.
But didn't it come up in the study session that they just had? I mean, and they did not object.
They didn't talk about it though.
And I just wonder if it's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody wants to bring up, but whatever it is, it just needs, the question needs to be asked, and there needs to be an answer, and it needs to be a majority say yes or no, so we know what we're dealing with. It's just, to me, very straightforward.
Right. And I think
that could be a tactic though. The fact that they're that's their way of acceding to the proposal without saying, I accede to this proposal, which then creates all of this backlash and community response. Sometimes your silence is your approval. I mean, this is not trying to just simply let things slip by. They have a really good record of reading everything. So I doubt that they're just not thinking about the fact that the proposed housing element has eliminated their authority to be part of the review process. I think they're fully.
I know they're fully aware of it. I just don't know where they stand on it. And I also think, as far as the public goes, is that if you explain, I think the public understands that this is something that Sacramento is imposing, and that we have to comply. And these are steps that the city is taking. And we need to be able to educate people that this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. This is why it's a good thing. And in the long run, it'll accrue benefit to the city. And here's how. So I just think, it's important to put the whole thing in context for people who might be all upset about it, and just explain to them, sure, this is a compromise that needed to be made, but here's the reasons why. And this is why in the balance, this is something we needed to do, and it's, you know, a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think actually when they discuss the appeal process, they'll have to discuss this. I mean, it'll have to come up, you
You're
know.
right. You're right.
And then the other suggestion that we made, I think in the letter, was that they allow ministerial decisions by, you know, by staff of any project that's less than 5 units. And that would be something new.
That would be very new.
And so that will also bring up the fact that the council no longer has any authority, and neither does the planning commission.
Is this something, Sue, that you, is this one of your questions about the ministerial approval of?
Yes, yes, yes.
Can I ask that? Okay.
That's one of my questions. So, and then,
How, Sue,
oh,
how widely has that, Sue, how widely has that proposal been aired?
not
about-
widely. I think it was in our letter, and I think when we talked to Nick, he thought it was a very good idea.
Yes.
And it's what
Had
happens.
he
if-
done that? Had he experience with that process elsewhere?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So he suggested it or he just agreed?
He agreed. He thought it was a good idea. When we
Okay.
talked,
He agreed and he validated it by saying that that's what happens in many other agencies.
right.
Okay.
So-
How can that message get further shared with not just our small group of housing advocates, but more widely in the community, that some of the what would you call it, city council oversight, you know, down to the last comma is being released to staff, and that's a good
It's
thing.
letter and it's, you know, if you're, I mean, it's already in the element to the extent that any members of the public are, you know, marching their way through that housing element. You know, it's all there. The question, I guess, is maybe you're asking is, you know, we need to distill some of the key changes for the public to, you know, somehow distill, you know, lots and lots of pages down to 1 or 2 pages. I think that's a
Yes,
valid.
yes.
And you
I
know
did-
what,
Yes.
that needs to be part of the city's housing element website. And, you know, there needs to be an FAQs that's concise and kind of brings up all the important points. This is new, this is what, you know, these are the major changes.
Mhm.
And the city manager's weekly, you know, update can point people to that. The town crier could point people to that. You know, organizations could say, you know, take a look at this page on the website. It explains some of the major changes. There needs to be, you know, that, what's her name? What's her name? Sonia, the public relations person needs to do better communications. And maybe Nick and Gabe, that's some of the things we can suggest as to how you get this info out. Because one of the big things that HCD wagged their finger at them about was public and community outreach.
Right.
And so we can just make that as a suggestion.
I think that's a good idea. And also, I mean, I'm sure Bruce Barton is open to, you know, other voices or whatever it's called, that are a little longer than letters to the editor, and different people could do them. I mean, the league could do one, Laha could do one, you know.
And
It-
maybe even an article,
one-
maybe even an article by one
Yeah.
of his reporters where she could interview Nick.
Yeah,
Maybe, why don't we ask Bruce if well, first we should ask Gabe and Nick if they're okay with that. But if they are, we could ask Bruce if he would have one of his reporters
yeah,
do kind of a really in-depth article on.
right. I'm sure he would, and he might participate in the thing himself, because Bruce is very interested in housing.
Yes.
It's almost as though we need a weekly series, you know, kind of along the lines of physical
I
abuse,
agree.
domestic abuse, and it's been in there for weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months. And it's a little chunk at a time. You know, there's no reason why that Bruce, I would think Bruce would be amenable to establishing a weekly kind of chunk of the
That's a
paper.
great idea.
Mhm.
That's a great idea.
1 or 2 points.
And you know
Um,
what, too, that helps. That
would-
helps, Janine, because it doesn't overload somebody, you know, and giving them, you know, little pearls every week. That's a great idea.
But it also
Well, the other
doesn't.
thing is, what's the deadline for all of this approval? So there's kind of an end point when this might not be necessary, so that, you know, if it's not like it would have to go on all year long, but the what would you say, the most contentious, the hardest to explain could come relatively sooner.
We hope
Firstly,
it'll be
easy.
January. We hope it'll be January.
But the
I
process
actually-
is gonna go on because of the rezoning, and the rezoning, even people who haven't been paying attention to the housing element being adopted, you know, will pay more attention when the specific rezoning. So I think, Susan, it could go on for a while. We'd have to watch, you know, as needed or whatever.
Okay,
No, I don't, I believe that it needs to go on. And let's say today we had a perfect housing element and they actually miraculously, they said, go ahead, approve it. We don't have anything. It's thank you and go forward. That's what our HCD letter said instead. I think that this education of the public would still be necessary.
Yeah.
Plow through perfect housing element. So we need to bite out the top 50 chunks. And this is because now when you go to, you know, if you happen to be if you happen to be wealthy enough in this city where you're going to perhaps redevelop the building you happen to own downtown, of which we have many, you need to know how this is going to impact you. So that education is really important, whether or not, regardless of where we are in the approval process.
good
That's
point.
That's a very good point.
Good point.
And there's so many different aspects too, like how this is going to roll out. If, for example, Rancho actually was redeveloped, I mean, that would be a big deal. And there would be a lot of education required about that, how it's going to affect everybody, what's the businesses, what are going to happen to all the businesses, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
Okay.
To your questions, Sue?
I only have one more, and that was, how can we better address affirmatively furthering fair housing? Because that's been a problem for almost every city across the board, but I would just be curious what he has to say about it.
So Janine,
mind?
do you have more specific questions about that topic that we could list?
Yeah. So my questions, first I had some general ones. Along the lines of some of the talk that we've already had here, as far as FAQs, for example, I was also thinking about FAQs, but something more specific. In reading, and I haven't read comprehensively, but at least surveying other agencies' housing elements submissions, one thing that I noticed, and I couldn't find it in ours, but maybe I'm wrong because I haven't completely finished reading ours either. But in going through the chapters and going through the table of contents, I couldn't find this. Other agencies establish a massive spreadsheet, and this spreadsheet has along the left column literally the quoted public comments that they have gathered throughout this period. And they're not attributed. In some cases they might be, but they're usually not attributed. They're just words, you know. And then there is a column to the right where whoever is conducting the spreadsheet answers that public comment, addresses that public comment and then in the third column says, here's where you find the answer in our element on this page in this paragraph. Or they say, we do not believe that this needs to be addressed. And then the third column, they give a rationale. Right.
Actually,
But the
in
point is, do we have that in our housing element, Susan?
Yeah, you know, in Mountain View, I'm not positive it's in the housing element itself, but it's in the material that's being presented to HCD. So, you know, I don't know if it's actually, I'd have to check and see if it's part of the housing element, but they actually quote, whether it was YIMBY or the League of Women Voters, they go through every comment that was made and then how they're handling it. So they do name who did it, whether it's an individual or whatever. But I don't know if it's part of the housing element, Janine, or just part of the documentation, but it is documented.
How about ours? How
What
about
that
ours?
does, what that spreadsheet does, even if it isn't part, even if it's just a cosend, if you will, it allows them to say that they have, you know, it's allowed to express the comprehensiveness of their direct community outreach in terms of responsiveness. And so then when they have that little paragraph in the housing element where you have to talk about that, they get a big, nice check mark. My question to you, Susan, is I could not find that in our housing element or in any of the attachments that come with it. Do you know if it's, do we do the same thing? Because I wanted to ask Nick to do that. I know I can go to the Los Altos housing .org website and I can find all the feedback at the website, but nobody has tabulated that into a document that we can ship off, either show to the public or ship off ACD. That was going to be one of my requests.
Yeah,
And hopefully he says, oh, Janine, it's on, whatever.
Oh, sorry.
it would be a question. I mean, I think Sonia was in charge of most of that. And then Nick wasn't here for most of it. So I think he would have to rely on Sonia to go back, and it might help for them to put it on. I mean, frankly, between us, I think our outreach was stinky. But you know what? It was stinky in Mountain View too. And they made more of an effort to reach lower income neighborhoods and stuff. But you know, it's very difficult to reach renters. For example, in Mountain View, it's almost 50% renters, but they don't come out to meetings. They don't go to Zoom. You know, it's just difficult for them to participate in anything. So the feedback was really very, very minimal. And in both cities, I think it was groups like ours, you know, and people who were actively involved, who were the ones that went to all the meetings. And you know, they can talk about these meetings at the library, but Janine, you and I went to one that I think there were 5 of us at or something, you know.
Right.
I mean,
that's one of the big problems. They have workshops, but 4 or 5 people show up and it's the same 4 or 5 people every time. So
of course it was.
I don't know how they're going to, I just don't know how they're going to show that they've done an effective outreach to low income groups, for example. And do we even have the demographics on low, you know, perhaps we do, but how many people does that mean we have to reach in Los Altos? You know,
I don't know, but one of the things that they could have done better is they could have gone to CSA and asked if, you know, at least for staff to participate or for staff to do some sort of a survey, and the same at the Day Worker Center. And I don't think they did as much outreach that way as they should have. They could have maybe gone to Safeway and asked if they could have a meeting sometime. They wouldn't have gotten all of the Safeway workers, but maybe they could have asked for some to participate by way of a survey. They just didn't make those big efforts. Now, part of it was COVID. I mean, let's be fair that it was difficult during COVID to do a lot of this stuff. So, and I don't think we can recover it all in January, but I think it is all the more reason to push on the outreach as we go forward, you know.
So in my public comments to through the website back in the day, and I don't remember the date I did this, I wrote an extensive commentary about low wage worker outreach. And I gave a bunch of ideas, at least 3 or 4 more, of things that they could do during shifts to reach out to low wage workers. And with the understanding, as my comment said, that the majority of these low wage workers will not, the overwhelming majority of these low wage workers will not be living in Los Altos. They live outside of Los Altos. In some cases, maybe in Mountain View, I have spoken to workers that drive here from Salinas. So it's, and everything in between, a lot in San Jose, etc. Some in Moon Bay that come over. And so I never got a response to that. I want somebody from our staff that say, hey, Janine, we looked at your suggestions for reaching out to low wage workers. The reason I didn't want to only suggest CSA and the Day Worker Center is because in both of those cases, I think that outreach is important, by the way, both of those entities. But the reason I think it's necessary but insufficient is because in both cases, the people that come to them, they are coming to CSA, they are coming to the Day Worker Center. The kind of outreach that HCD expects is not only that, but they also expect you to reach out to people that don't necessarily come to you. You have to go to them. And when it comes to low wage workers, the only place to go to them is on the job. And so that means that staff would need to organize with the bosses, with the managers and the supervisors for a given shift, say it's a day shift, an evening shift, or a night shift, and give their workers some time during work, 30 minutes, like say attach it to their lunch or something like that, where we could go in there and do some outreach vis-a-vis a survey, and they would need to have an interpreter probably or more. And they do a survey, or they gather some contemporaneous information from open-ended questions, whatever process they want to use. That is the only way to do it, because you can't catch them going in because they don't want to be late. You can't catch them coming out because they want to go home. And you can't catch them driving through the city, so it's very critical. Now, when I asked privately a city council member about that very topic, they said, yes, great idea, but here's the problem. It's very likely that at this point, and again, I'm being candid, which is why I'm not going to name names. At this point, and for the foreseeable short-term future, Los Altos probably would not be welcoming to people that are low-wage workers living here. And I said, well, clearly that's discriminatory. And they said, yes, it is discriminatory, but it is a fact, to the extent that a lot of low-wage workers may not want to live in Los Altos, even if there is affordable housing here, because they won't feel welcome. And I said, well, how do we get over that hump? And I said, I don't have an answer for you, Janine. So that, I think, is somehow the undercurrent with doing proactive outreach to our low-wage workers. So when the city, when they think about affordable housing, they're not actually thinking about low-wage workers, to be honest. They're thinking about young people, they're thinking about teachers, they're thinking about police officers, and they're not low-wage, but they're still thinking about them in that category. And, they're thinking about the people that are earning, $60,000 to $70,000 to $80,000 a year. They're not thinking about the people that are still earning $37,000 a year or $27,000 a year, because those are the low-wage workers. Those are the ones that have two jobs. So this is a problem, and this is going to be my big issue with Nick, because in affirmatively furthering fair housing, there is the issue of the distribution, the spectrum of your fair housing. And it's questionable to me whether or not our housing element really has any hope of meeting what's called the true low end of affordable housing. And so that's one question that I have for him. I want to push harder on that. And I want to get specific responses to my question about outreach to low-wage workers. I want them to say, yes, we will do it. Or, you know what? No, we're not going to do it. And we're going to accept that risk that's going to cause our element to fail. The other thing about affirmatively furthering that I think is important is we failed in the area where we have to tie our current demographics to history. Specifically in the letter, it's paragraph, paragraph B, housing needs, resources, and constraints, subparagraph 1, and it's under the category of what they call racial, the ethnic concentrated areas of affluence, RCAA. We just make a little comment in our housing element, but the city, the HCD requires historical data to show how the patterns have become the way they are, and how that relates to our surrounding regions. It's dramatic when we're right next to a city like Mountain View and we're right next to a city like Sunnyvale that have dramatically different RCAAs, and it looks very intentional that our city has become this way. And HCD is basically saying you have to prove to us that you're going to break those patterns of segregation, and say nothing about that. So that's another area that's going to cause our housing element to fail, even if we meet the RENA number, even if we have, get rid of design review, latencies, all those things. If we're going to continue the fact that our city is classified as an area that has racially segregated concentrations of people, it's going to be a problem for us. And so what I'd like Nick to, I just want him to answer, how is he going to fix that paragraph in our housing element? What does he have planned? But more specifically, if he, maybe it's another meeting, we can get into more detail because we only have an hour, but we need to talk about that. We need to figure out, we have 2 racially segregated areas and in the negative, and that is El Camino and certain parts of South Los Altos. And it's highlighted in the demographics. We have to fix that. So I don't know how to do that myself. I'm urban planner, but we have to fix it.
And I wanted to just talk about that for a minute because what I'm interested in knowing are the details of what they're citing. So, for example, when we break out the demographics, when you look at the demographics for Los Altos, it really doesn't do a great job of breaking out. It has white, Asian, Black, mixed races, or more than, I think it's 2 races or more. But it doesn't have any fine tuning as far as I can tell. So for example, what exactly are they pointing to as areas of being racially segregated? I'd like an answer to that question. I mean, it's very difficult to say. We have almost no Black community members. I mean, so is that something that they are saying we are racially segregated? But that's the entire town. That's the entire city. So if you look at what we actually have, as far as I can see with my own eyes, we have white, we have Asian, and we have South Asian. To me, those are the 3 main categories. And then how do you break out Latinos? I mean, are they included in the white population? I don't see any data that specifically calls them out. So I'm wondering, what exactly is this statement that HCD, what are the details and how do we address that?
And I think that's a good question to ask, because you have to get into the kind of the higher level specifications for what the HCD wants the various housing elements to look like. But to touch some of what you said, it's not just a matter of ethnicity. And you made a comment, Latinos and Hispanics are in fact categorized by our census under white. And there's a movement trying to change that, because what it does is it makes Hispanics and Latinos or Latinos, whatever word you want to use, Latinx, it makes us disappear. So
it's invisible.
So for example, the number of Mexican, let's just say Mexican homeowners in the city is like 2. I'm one of them. Okay. Really, really low. We actually have fewer Mexican Americans in our city than we do Black people. And the comment about that the housing that HCD makes in our letter that says, let me see, the briefly mentions HCD's recent data related to RCAAs within the city, within Los Altos, but generally should also evaluate the patterns and changes over time at a local and regional level. Local mean neighborhood to neighborhood within the city, and regional mean how our city maps up to other neighboring cities in the region. These areas of affluence, they cross 2 axes. It's not only your race / ethnicity, it's also your wealth. Because, for example, I'm Mexican American. So there's a lot of baggage that comes with that in this city for sure. And I've endured that for 30 plus years now, including getting stopped by the police all the time. But I also don't fall, and I'm affluent. I'm wealthy. Okay. I'm a homeowner, a homeowner, whatever you want to gradient you want to use. I also have, there's a third axis, which is, are you known to the city or not? It doesn't mean are you famous? It means, are you fully participating, fully taking advantage of the opportunities your city offers? The housing element has all kinds of comments about opportunity. I
Right.
do have access to opportunity, okay, because I've lived here so long. And so on two of those axes, I'm A-okay. On one of the axes, I'm really bad. I can't look left and right and find anybody like me here in the city. Okay. And so even the young woman, Adriana, that just opened Tal Palo, she can't afford to live here, even though she's a business owner here and that they're about to open. But I made sure I've gotten used to her, because one of my goals in life is to get her to move here so that I may be a second, Mexican American in the city. The other thing that's important is take Black people. If we actually fulfill the requirements in the housing element, which is to show our history over time, the number of Black people in this city has dropped dramatically over the last 10 years. We are driving Black people out of our city. And the reason why a lot of this can be recorded, it's not in the housing element, it can be recorded through the schools, is a lot of times because the kids in our schools get treated very poorly, Black kids in our schools. And then the adults don't find community here. So that also drives Black people out. Now, what we have had a huge influx over the last 15 years, 10 years in particular, is. But remember when I talked about axes, the grand majority of the Asians that have moved here are exceedingly wealthy. They're wealthier than the white people.
Yes.
They're buying up property, they're buying up houses, they're paying cash for their homes. And so that brings with it a different kind of segregation. And it doesn't necessarily meet with, this is going to sound terrible, but it's just the three of us, the four of us here. This doesn't meet with favor in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? It's like the elites coming in. They're actually outspending the incumbent affluence. And so therefore, they're not really helping us. They're helping us ethnically, but they're not helping us in terms of the affluence issue. So, unfortunately, in a lot of Asian and Southeast Asian demographics, you have a lot of stratification where they're the exceedingly wealthy and then they're the exceedingly poor. Sometimes those align with sub-ethnicities and sometimes they don't. But for example, I could probably assure you with reasonable confidence that if you look at the residents in Los Altos, Sunnyvale, and Mountain View as a sub-region, and you look at the Asian population, and I'm going to dump in the Southeast Asian as well, that the affluent, the really high-end ones are the wealthy Chinese, Taiwanese, and the Brahmins of the Indian culture. And then the Vietnamese and the Filipinos are way down at the low end, and they live in the lower end areas of those three cities. And they may not own property, or most likely to be renters. And this is just me perusing demographics and how they tend to happen that way. So all these create problems for Los Altos because we're just the affluence gets in the way even of our racial mixing, because you can't look at Los Altos today and say we're white. We're not all white because we have way too many Asians to call ourselves that. What we all are is wealthy. That creates problems for the housing element. So that's all I want to say of that. I really want to be able to spew this at Nick. I haven't had the opportunity to spew all this at Nick and then hear his response and how he's going to quantify that into our housing element response. Nobody ever wants to talk about this factor in the housing element. We're really worried about densities and units and heights and neighborhoods and rezoning, but nobody talks about this issue. So we may not be able to talk about it in this 1 hour meeting we've had with him. I feel like I need to set up a 1 hour meeting with him to really have a come to Jesus, so to speak, about this topic. That's all I got.
Okay.
Janine, you've had some really good points there. And I'm wondering in anticipation of a meeting with Nick, if you could condense those thoughts to a one-pager so that you could have that at the ready when you do get a chance to talk to him, because those are important points. But you're right, a 1 hour meeting with him is not going to give you a chance to explore all of those points, but it'd be great to have them at the ready, the short version.
Yes.
If you
So for this
possibly
meeting, I
could.
want to bring up two things. One is that spreadsheet I mentioned, where it's direct,
Uh-huh.
direct response to all and every single public input they've gotten. And two is to ask them about the low-wage worker hours.
Yes.
Okay, well, Janine, I would like to ask him just the generic question of how we better address the affirmatively furthering fair housing, because I actually don't think there's an easy answer to what you're saying, other than rezoning to have more multifamily zoning, more multifamily, for example. I don't really know how we attract people from these other ethnic groups to come. I mean, my experience from working in the schools and stuff is that low income people who are Latinos in Mountain View would love to live here, and they're very happy I live near Santa Rita. They're very happy going to Santa Rita, and I help with the AVID program. They're very happy with the high school. So I don't think it's that they're being driven out, but it's a question of the money. And the only way that I know to try and solve the problem is to start by having more multifamily zoning and allowing, smaller units. So, and then if we have a BMR program, or we find a way to fund more affordable housing, like the one that we're doing, but we need to have a lot more of it, and we don't have any money. So, I mean, I know. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
So when you talk about multifamily, does that mean that something like a duplex could possibly be acceptable in Los Altos? Question mark.
Well,
in the people
SB
had, the thumbs down to that.
Well, SB9 is a help,
You just hit on the third question that I wanted to ask, which is, so the third question I wanted to ask is only peripherally related to AFFH. It's really about distribution, geographic distribution, with the city being 95+% R1, and that R1 is very highly constrained to being large. And when I say quarter acre, I'm throwing that into the large category. Quarter acre and up size, it creates problems for the geographic equitable distribution of fair housing. And so we have so many areas in our city right now that are currently on the ground, boots on the ground. They are denser than quarter acre R1 requirement, but we haven't codified those. I really think that we should. I think that the city should codify, and even if those, let's say, take the San Luis home, the homes on San Luis.
Mhm.
Little homes, they all cross boundary lines. They've been there forever. I believe that at one owner, all of them. There may be two, but I think it's one owner. And the reason the city doesn't want to rezone that to stay in R2 or R3, R2 allowing duplex, R3 allowing 3 and I think up to 10, is because they don't want to constrain. They're afraid that if that owner sells the land outright, that then somebody will come in and build a 3-story structure there, and the neighbors will fall apart. And I said, well, can't you write a qualification into your R3 that says, the houses can be smaller on smaller parcels, but they still have to conform to the height scale of the surrounding homes, no more than 2 stories, for example, or 2 stories with a tiny little, pulpit or something like that, but still small. And you can't put a 5-story there or 6-story there. But now what you've got is 8 homes in the area where normally 2 homes would be. And now that more than a duplex will strike a little bit more of affordability. We've seen duplexes in the city, but it's still zoned at R1. And we have large lots that are standing empty and have stood empty for 20 years. And there's no incentive to develop on them. And wouldn't it be nice to put a little, like in LA, they have these little small houses around a beautiful courtyard. And we could put something like that on an acre, and we could meet the needs of 10 families. And yes, it would be right in the middle of the neighborhood, but it would still be gorgeous. It would be beautiful, 1 story. And so, it doesn't seem to me that the city wants to be creative. And that's the third question I want to ask, which is, Can't we be more creative within R1 without violating the sacrosanct nature of scale, but still making density higher? So anyways, that's my last question. That was.
And I wanted to say something to that point about geographical distribution of the affordable housing, because I attended one of the HCD meetings where they had the three people, the top people that are in the enforcement division. And that was one of their big focuses is not ghettoizing low income housing. And one of the things that I don't like about the way this has been laid out is that they have clustered all of the low income housing together. And rather than distributing it evenly out amongst, the town of Los Altos. And when I spoke to the Lisa Wise consultants, they said, oh, well, it's because of the restrictions on density. We can't do I think it's 40 units per acre that we have to have for low income housing. We can't do that, for example, on the downtown parking plazas. And you just ask yourself, why not? All it requires is rezoning them. It doesn't require, an act of nature to change, so I think we are getting bogus answers about why we cannot have low income housing all over the city. And to me, I just can't help but think that if you have really dense housing, but it's in the town, it's in the city proper, people have much better access to all of the amenities, all of the shopping that they need to do, there's a much better probability there's going to be some sort of public transportation access. So, and I wrote to the city very explicitly going through that. And I didn't see it even listed in the public comments. So I've raised it several times to the people who were in charge before Nick Zornes came. But that's my big issue, is that I don't think it's gonna pass. I mean, if what those three people who head up the enforcement agency for HCD, if they are true to their word, that's what they're going to look at. You have to distribute your low income housing all throughout the city. And it doesn't count to just put the moderate income housing all clustered downtown and all the very low income housing all clustered at Rancho. That is not compliant with affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I want to address that with him.
Yeah, well, I think that they do have the plan that they would use one of the downtown parking lots for all affordable housing. So that would be very low income housing there. That's in the draft element.
But when I see the map, it's all color coded as moderate.
Well, I'm just saying if that's one of the programs. So, I mean, they are planning on that. Yeah.
I think the reason it's color coded moderate is because we should ask this, maybe they're counting on city subsidy to build at higher density. Because the color coding doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, the color coding on the maps didn't signify specific zoning, did it?
It signified specific income levels.
Right. Okay. So the question is, if they're looking for that to be very low income level in that parking plaza, they might still have the door open on the density, the amount of density. Because at the end of the day, to make any very low affordable housing feasible, it's got to be dense. It's got to be tall.
It does.
I think the state law allows them to go for 100% density bonus, so I mean, it can be very, but that's not, that's not written into the thing. But I'm just saying, if you really look realistically at the housing element, they are planning for at least one plaza to be like that. And now that they have to upzone, you know, on San Antonio, the OA district, there's a possibility of maybe some moderate there, or, you know, and a lot of these places where they're going to get more units, there will at least be BMR units. So, and those aren't really all factored into, you know, where you're spreading your low income or your very, very low income housing on those maps, is what I'm saying. And it's the same with Rancho. Unless it's sold to an affordable housing developer, it's not going to be all very low income. But if they do a lot of housing there, then it would have a high number of units that are BMRs. So I don't think you can go by those color codings, I guess, that much, Freddie. And I mean, my feeling is they actually, when you look at the OA districts and you look at, you know, and you look at downtown and you look at Rancho, and then when you look at the churches where Nick is insistent that he has gotten good feedback from these two churches on doing something, that you are trying to spread it out probably as much as you can without completely taking away the R1 zoning. And from my perspective, I feel like what has to happen in the future is that we have to be not only code compliant with the ADU laws, but with the S9 law, which we're not, and that we will eventually get, you know, get more density on the R1 places because of SB9. I mean, it may be a slow process, just like the ADU process was slow, but that's how we have to move in terms of like breaking the R1 zoning, I guess.
Well, they need to make that really clear. And I have to tell you, in my discussions, and we had a very long meeting with Lisa Wise Consulting, and that was not the information I got. The reason the low income housing is all being dumped in Rancho is because they could get the 40 units per acre there where they could not get that downtown. And again, they could get that downtown. It's just a matter of rezoning. So I just want to make that point, and I want him to make it explicit as to where things are going, because the other thing is substantial evidence. They have to show that they have substantial evidence that any non-vacant property that is on the inventory site, that it will be redeveloped within the cycle.
Right.
And
That's
so,
why Sue's question about the parking plan is so critical.
well, not only that, but you know, he has to show HCD substantial evidence that Rancho, the owner of Rancho, intends to redevelop that property within the next 8 years, and that the churches plan, you know, are absolutely planning to to build within the next 8 years. And so if he has that evidence, that substantial evidence, I would think that should be a part of the public record. I, for one, would like to see that, because
I don't think, Freddie, from looking at this in Mountain View, I don't think he has to have like a letter of intent or anything from the property owner. What he can't have is a letter like from Vidovich saying, no way am I redeveloping Rancho. But let me tell you, Vidovich would be happy to redevelop Rancho if he can get the density and what he wants, because he's in it to make money, and we all know that. So
I understand that. I just want to know, I understand that you can't have a letter that says I don't want it, but I'm interested in, what does HCD actually consider substantial evidence? And what does he have in writing that sets that, that sets that out from HCD? What defines substantial evidence?
They actually do specify that. It includes leases, whether they're writing leases. Yeah. There are a bunch of other requirements, that if push comes to shove, Nick at some point will have to, may have to defend his stance with that kind of substantial evidence. He's been somewhat, in my opinion, he's not a cheeky guy. He seems to be very straightforward and honest. But in this particular area, he's being kind of cheeky because he's not willing to say, he says he has it on good merit, or I had a personal conversation, but he's not willing to put anything on the record. So maybe a question for him would be, rather than, when are you going to put these on the record, these beliefs that you have, or these comments that these interactions you're having with these people where you believe the churches should remain in the inventory. He's already proven slippery about answering that, making those commitments, but maybe we could ask him, why are you not willing to put these down more firmly, that you've had these conversations? Is there something because the owner doesn't want to commit, or because the owner doesn't want to get backlash from their neighbors? Or, I mean, what is it? Because I'm perfectly happy to be respectful of somebody's, personal decisions about their property, but it makes me a little uncomfortable because Nick seems otherwise to be extremely straightforward. And it's just on this one thing that he seems to be avoiding the question.
Well, see, I think with the churches, Janine, if I were the minister or whoever was, in charge, I would not want to speak out about this until I'd really had a full conversation with the church congregation. I think that could be a real backlash to have something on the record before you'd had a full discussion. So I could sort of understand that,
But does that mean that, I mean, my point is that if the pastor of the church doesn't have the weigh-in or the buy-in of his congregation, is he really in a position to make those promises to Nick? No. So for example, let's just take Rancho, where it's more clear cut. It's an owner. So he either has something from the owner or he doesn't. And so maybe what we could ask is, what substantial evidence do you have from the owner of Rancho Shopping Center, for example, that you can provide to HCD as substantial evidence that they intend to redevelop this property within the next cycle?
I think it's a legitimate question. To be fair, the whole upzoning with Rancho came because of AB 2011. And so it's something new for Vidovich to ponder, really. It didn't come with the draft housing element. It came because of the law being changed in terms of the density you could now do there in the stories. So he would have to.
But they put it on.
They put it on before.
And
I
I
was
just
more comfortable before, but now I think.
I'm just not feeling confident that they had any basis for actually putting these non-vacant properties on without, and that they didn't really have the buy-in from the owners. And so, for example, you're seeing that with Los Altos Hills, with St. Nicholas and other places where they are writing in and saying, no, we told you no, and now we're telling you no in writing.
Right.
What do we need to do?
Yeah, I don't know what you can get away with. I mean, in Mountain View, for example, they've had conversations with the owners of the Shoreline theaters who are interested in, they're talking about thousands of units there. And it's a whole new thing. It wasn't in the draft and now they're putting it in. And I don't know what HCD, I mean, I'm sure that this group is going to ask the people, the person at HCD about this on Monday, but because, wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know this is uncharted territory. One of the other questions I have is, how much data does HCD want them to provide them that has never been collected historically or today? Are there requirements that HCD is imposing that they absolutely can't meet because no data?
I don't know, Nick seemed to say when he was talking with us, correct me if I'm wrong, Janine, that he thought that they could provide the data. He didn't seem very worried about both coming into compliance with the current state law, that he thought that would be a no-brainer to do that quickly and to provide the data, that they just had to do it,
Yeah, and in fact, he was so confident that it kind of, led me to suspect that they have the data and we're just playing a game of, I'm going to put as little as I possibly can and feel good about it in the element and see what gets accepted.
Yeah.
Because it's just, to have that kind of confidence, oh yeah, I think we'll be able to fill that out. You can't say that without having something in your pocket. Or, I'm hoping that he doesn't prove to be brazen in terms of saying, oh yeah, it's easy to come up with historical data, because it's not.
Well, Mountain View's been the same, and they've taken the same tactic that, it's going to, they wanted to go the first round and sort of do the minimum of what they thought they could do and not get a terrible letter from HCD, and then work their way up to being compliant. And I think Nick took that same philosophy and the council did. Let's put in what we think we can do and not, that's why they didn't put the heights that they would go up to, you know, and left a lot of blanks. So.
Well, it'll be interesting. And I know this is just, I was looking and I, at least within our little region, none of the cities has put in their second draft and gotten a second review letter from HCD, to my knowledge. And
Right.
one of the questions and he can't answer it because nobody knows, is, you know, what's the likelihood that HCD is going to raise new issues in their second review letter, which will make it impossible then to get our housing element, you know, revised, reviewed, adopted, certified by the deadline.
Oh,
I can't imagine them raising new issues.
yeah, from
You mean
talking,
new issues?
yeah, no,
Who knows?
I don't think that would happen.
I
No,
hope
I
it
don't think that would
happen.
happen.
I hope it won't happen. It would be, you know, enormously unfair if it did
Right.
happen.
right.
But
I think the only thing that will happen is if somebody just continues to defy the law, believing that, you know, they have some rationale, and then HCD has to come back and say, no.
Yeah.
Will
Or if
happen.
they put some whole new thing in that they didn't put in the first time, that seems to be, again, you know, not with the program, then yeah. Or if they put in a bunch of sites that are totally unrealistic or something and they weren't in there before,
Yeah.
things like that. But, you know, if they're just explaining what they did before and improving on it, or I think that would be very unfair. And I think that's what the city of Mountain View thinks also.
I agree, and I think we all think that. I have this, if you know, listening to HCD, they just have this whole new mentality about, you know, we finally have the teeth to do something to you people, and by God, we are going to bite this time. So
The reality is, Freddie, that we kind of deserve it. I mean, agencies have not been building housing aids, and look at the mess we're in. It's just, if everybody building had been urban planning, had been building incrementally, had not sprawled, we would be in such better shape right now. So I'll give them props for being a little giddy that they have teeth now, but you know, I don't think they're going to be, you know, I don't look at this as an imposition. You know, matter of fact, when I talk about with people, when I'm trying to make them understand that our city needs this vibrancy that will result from more housing and different kinds of people and different income levels and more kids and all that. I don't look at it as the state imposing on us. I look at it as the state being the thoughtful parent that is going to get these rambunctious kids in line so that they don't mess themselves up any further. And it's going to make our cities better, and it's going to get homeless people eventually off the street. At first, it won't do any of that, but eventually it will. And it'll help us figure out how to keep people in homes rather than becoming homeless. So, you know, it's not easy. It's going to be hard. It's scary. You know, I live here right across San Antonio from Egan, and I fully expect that in the next 10 years, there's going to be a very very tall teacher housing building right, you know, in my backyard. But I'm all for it. Then maybe my son can live here instead of 90 minutes away. So I'm okay. I'm trying to adjust myself to the fact that the city is growing, the state is growing, and we have to put people somewhere.
Yeah, and brings up the other question that I don't want to ask him, but I was disappointed that they didn't really talk to the school district. And I actually talked to Brian Johnson about it, and he said they didn't approach the school district, which was a shame, you know.
well, the other thing that, you know, I think the sad thing though, Janine, is that I don't think any of this affordable housing is going to get built unless the state starts kicking in some big money. So it's one thing to make all these impositions or whatever you want to call it, rules, requirements, but it's a whole nother thing when they don't provide any of the money to do it. So
Here's how the business model is going to work, though. It's not going to be the state, because in order for the state to do it, ultimately you end up having to raise taxes, and people hate it when taxes get raised. But what's going to happen is creative business strategies and improvements in our tax code that enable developers to make money and to survive, to build affordable housing. If you look at, for example, the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley. Do you know Julie Mahowald?
No.
She's my neighbor. She lives right here on my cul-de-sac. She's a CFO for the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley. And she came to this, she came and spoke at the UW social that happened this past weekend. And she showed the business model of how an entity such as the Housing Trust, as a nonprofit, can gather investment money from corporations, massive amounts of money, because the tax code favors companies that help beneficent organizations. The smallest grant was $1 million, and the other grants are much larger. And then this trust manages as though they're a VC. They're not a VC, but it's as though think of it as a nonprofit VC. And then they give that money to agencies, cities and counties, and individual developers to build affordable housing. That's all they do. And the money is made, and they didn't have to use any tax money, or state monies. So these kinds of business models are emerging that should, because at the end of the day, it doesn't help corporations to have a bunch of homeless people around their skirt edges, right? It doesn't help. It's a blight. And I don't want to call people blight, but you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And so they're invested in trying to help solve the problem. And since a lot of agencies like ours, or Mountain View, for example, it took Mountain View forever to agree to have Google build housing. But even then, Mountain View, correct me if I'm wrong, Susan, Mountain View will not let Google build their own housing. It has to be, you're going to help build housing for anybody to live in. It's not for Google employees. Mm-hmm. Employees may live there, but that's because they've come in through the open market to buy something or rent something. But there are many companies that want to return to that very old model of building on-site housing for their employees to eliminate the whole transit thing. And there are philosophical questions that you can argue. Well, does an employee really want to be so tied to their employer that they live in their housing? Well, what if I want to leave that company? It kind of flies in the face of at-will employment. Mm-hmm. The point is, they are domiciles. And so the other big turf war is between schools and city agencies. We have a terrible relationship with our school districts in terms of autonomy. They are totally autonomous. They own their land. They have dominion over their land. We are the same with ours, and there the twain shall meet. It's unfortunate, but we're part of a free enterprise system, and that's the way our civics have worked, that schools own their own land and they have dominion over it. So their desire to participate in solving the homeless problem has to come only from them. But I have heard that, school districts are talking about building housing on their larger lots in various agencies. Same with community colleges. I really hope that someday Foothill will have some housing. Kenyatta College has housing. There's no reason why Foothill can't build it. But anyway, I think that counting on state money to build affordable housing is going to be more problematic. Instead, we should let the free market, vis-a-vis people's desire to make money and give money, to hide money, because that's essentially what they're doing through these donations to these trusts. That will result in more affordable housing in our city and in the valley.
Well, I hope you're right.
Well, actually, there's going to be a tax measure in the Bay Area also in 2024 that will try and replace Measure A money, and Los Altos should benefit from that. I'm going to have to go, but Freddie, this has been useful. Are you going to sort of
what I want to do? Can I do this? My suggestion is, let me take this video, convert it to a YouTube video, make it just for us to, not public, but just for us to see, and I'll send it to all of you. And then if we can each go through it, try to reconstruct the list of questions, and then can we just share documents and we'll get it together by next Friday.
Okay, sounds
work?
good.
Super.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question though. I'm behind on the news about the plan for next Friday for a get together. Would it be, Sue, would you send me the information?
I will. It's a Zoom invitation from Nick Zornes, and I'll send it to you again.
Okay.
So
And if
hopefully
it's,
it'll be the, Sue, are
if
you
it's
gonna be
late
on
enough in the
board?
afternoon, I'll be okay. Huh?
It's 3:30. And Sue, are you gonna be on the call or on the Zoom with
Yes.
Nick?
Yeah, yes, it's Monday that I have the problem.
Okay, and Janine, you'll be there? Susan, you'll be there?
3:30 should be okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it'll be the four of us.
And I think Marie Young also.
Who?
Who?
Marie
Oh,
Young.
Marie Young,
yeah.
that's correct.
And then I haven't heard back from Emily Marmos. I don't know if there's a possibility she could join us, but she works at SB at home. She
Oh,
would be a
that's
good,
right. Okay,
but I haven't heard back.
Well-
Did you get any input from Kevin?
I
Kevin?
never heard anything from Kevin.
Okay.
Sue,
All right,
did you?
No,
No.
I'll ask him again after our Monday night meeting, but he has not really been focusing on Los Altos because he's really focused on, which is a big
Oh,
deal.
okay.
Yeah,
I think we're
So-
gonna have plenty of questions for our 1 hour with Nick.
I do too.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Okay,
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.